All right, let's talk here, first of all, about good password management. And the key here is that we want to make sure that we have a good password. A good password meaning secure password. Now, these are all kind of A+ answers to what they would consider a strong password. CompTIA would say anything between 6 and 8 characters is considered a strong password. I have a difference with that. In the home environment, kind of maybe, yeah. But in corporate environments where there's sensitive data, a bare minimum is usually 8 characters. The reason for that is that there are hacking tools that are able to divide passwords that are smaller than 8 characters, so that would certainly include 6 or 7 characters here, and it's able to divide them up into kind of discrete parts and hack them and crack them easier than if they're 8 characters or more. It just has to do with the mechanics of the cryptography involved in passwords. Okay. So A+, 6 to 8, in real life, at least 8. Also, you need to have some level of complexity. This would include, in English anyway, English uppercase, English lowercase, numerals, westernized Arabic numerals, the 0, 1, 2, 3, and so forth, and non-alpha numerics, which would be special characters such as exclamation points, $, percent, all those sorts of things. You should include some degree of complexity in it of that nature. For example, if I wanted my password to be photography, I might start off lowercase. And by the way, it's very often better to make the first character lowercase because a lot of hackers will guess that. People will make the first character uppercase because that's often how it appears in actual real words. So, lowercase p, I don't know if that's lowercase p or not. I always write in block letters, but P, H, and then for O, maybe I'd put a 0. That's my number, okay? And then a T, and then for another O here, I might make a capital O. And then G, R, A, I might make an @ sign, P, H, Y, okay? So you get the idea there. I've got some complexity. It's also more than 8 characters. And by the way, that's not my real logon password, so don't even give it a try. I know you know that I like photography, but I assure you my password has nothing to do with it. Note to self, change password immediately. Okay, anyway, so that's the complexity. That's an idea of the complexity there. So we have lowercase, we have uppercase, we have numbers like the 0 here, and special characters like the @ sign right there. And again, it's more than 8 characters. If you have troubles with your users choosing passwords that are too simple, have them use a password generator. For example, remember we looked at a password generator at a previous nugget. I think that was the PC Tools one that we looked at there. In fact, let me try to bring that web page back over here. There it is. And this one we used in a previous nugget, and you can just make note of the URL there. You can have it generate a password for you if you're not creative enough right off the top of your head to generate one. Now, the problem with that is it's going to create a password that's, of course, complex and that will make no sense. It's not like it doesn't resemble a real word, so now you have to memorize every part of it, and it's not that easy to memorize. Also, A+ would say change your password every 90 to 180 days. Again, home environment, maybe. Small business, possibly. In corporate environments, you usually don't want to do that. The default, in fact, in Windows domains is every 42 days. And it's also really just kind of relative. I mean, for example, if my password here, let's see how many characters this is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. See, that's 11 characters. That's actually pretty good. The longer and more complex the password is, the more difficult it is to crack. Now, why is a matter of days important in changing your password policy? Well, there are hackers' tools out there that can, by brute force, try to guess what this password is. That takes time, though, and they usually will revolve around something like a dictionary attack. So it'll look for words in the dictionary or variations of words in the dictionary. Well, if they're complex, it's going to take more days to crack it. If it's easy, for example, if it was just the real word photography with no special characters or anything like that, it would crack it in a matter of seconds. Okay, so the number of days that you go in between changing your password really has to do with the password length and complexity. Some people use passphrases, which are entire sentences, and because they're so long, they don't use any complexity, but they're easy to remember. Well, password crackers might take a long, long time if they ever crack that. So in some environments, they don't have a password requirement to change it. All right, so this is very much relative to how long or complex your passwords are. Also, do not write down your password. Similarly to that, don't let people look over your shoulder when you're typing in your password. Don't let people know what your password is by sharing it with them. So, for example, if you're at lunch and someone from the office calls and they say, hey, I was trying to get this report, but I can't find it. Can you tell me where it is? Don't say, oh, go sit down at my computer and log in as me. My password is so on and so forth. Don't do that. And especially, again, do not write it down. Now, there's kind of an old joke where people say, oh yeah, users sometimes write their password down and put it on a Post-it note or tape it to their monitor. Well, a lot of IT professionals nowadays say, well, I think most users are well past that. Nobody does that anymore. Oh yeah? Well, recently, in fact, in the past couple of weeks here, I went to a large retail organization here in the state of Arizona. They have millions of dollars of inventory. And I was walking around waiting for a salesperson. I came across this. Login and password this is in plain English, so to speak, directly on their monitor. Now, go figure that out. Millions of dollars of invaluable inventory, and they're advertising their login name and password. That's another thing, by the way. Your login name and your password should never be the same thing. That's one thing that hackers easily guess. All right, so maybe you're thinking, okay, James, that was probably just some small retail environment, probably not that big a deal. Oh, yeah? I've seen it on college campuses, too. In fact, it was, I think in February, I came across this thing. This was the college campus here in Arizona, where they're talking about the Wi-Fi access that is available to the students. Guess what? There's a new wireless password. Right, the wireless network now requires a password. The Wi-Fi protected access pre-shared key, at least they're using some level of security until they did this. The password code is wireless. They're advertising this right on the little poster. This is on a poster that goes into the dorm of this college. I couldn't believe it. You can see that there's an EDU email address down here, which I've blacked all this out, and a phone number to call if you have any questions. Hello, IT department. How do you spell wireless again? I don't know what else you're going to ask them. It's pretty easy. I'll tell you, one of the best tools I have these days is my little cell phone with a camera on it. That's what I took both of these pictures with. They're not quite beautiful, but they sure are revealing, aren't they? So anyway, do not write down the password anywhere. Now let's talk about workstation security as well. Of course, workstations, laptops, that sort of thing. And one of the first things you'll want to do is to lock the workstation. Now, what does this do and why do you want to do it? You want to lock the workstation because it prevents the user from interacting with the workstation. In other words, there's no use out of the keyboard or mouse other than entering in the password to access the desktop. The reason why this is important is because a user might get thirsty. Did you know that getting thirsty can put your computer at risk? That's right, because you get up to go to the break room to get a Coca-Cola out of the vending machine, and while you're there, someone else could go by your desk, quickly access your desktop and browse through your files, steal your files, copy them to a thumb drive, do a lot of different things. This is even more important if you're a member of the IT department, because usually we have a higher level of privilege. Therefore, we have the ability to do things like change file permissions or access other files that common users are not able to access. You could delete user accounts. You could change people's passwords without telling them. I mean, all kinds of damage that you can do with an unlocked workstation. So make sure you lock it. The other way you could lock it besides using that method would be, for example, to hold down the Start key on the keyboard and then pressing the L key on the keyboard simultaneously. So Windows L is what that would be. And that's how I usually lock my workstation, just real quick. You don't have to do the Control-Alt-Delete thing. Another thing to look at here would be something like intrusion detection. We talked about that really early in our series, I think when I was talking about computer cases. But most computer cases right now have a little switch that when the door is fully closed, it closes that switch. But if you open up the case door, then it releases that switch. And as a result, it will instruct the motherboard and the BIOS that the case has been opened. So the next time the user starts up the computer, a message will appear to them, usually before they boot Windows, and it will say that the case was previously open. And that way, at least they know, hey, wait a minute, now was somebody in there? Maybe they install a keystroke logger, because that can be inserted in one of the USB ports, for example. Maybe they did some vandalism. Who knows whatever else they did. Anyway, that's something you need to know about, is that intrusion detection is possible using usually a BIOS setting. There's also a cable lock. This might be useful for something like an expensive monitor, which would be somewhat easy to just pick up, unplug all the cables, pick it up, and walk off with it. Well, some monitors, especially the more expensive ones, have a little. Let me show you here. If this is the side view of a monitor, for example. Okay, so this is where the user sits. Boy, that's a giant screen TV more like. But anyway, if this is where the monitor is and we're looking at the side view, a lot of times there will be a little slot here that you can insert a certain hardware device that cannot be removed. This is the same kind of thing you'll see on the backs of laptops. And if you ever go into an electronics store, they have laptops on display. Normally there's a cable that runs through this device right here that you cannot remove the laptop or the monitor. So a cable lock might be useful for that. In fact, some of them have alarms and everything like that in case someone were to cut that cable lock. There's also a drive lock, which is normally going to be on laptops only. This is something that you can configure in the BIOS, and you would specify a drive lock password. And then, when you power on the computer, the hard drive cannot be accessed until you type in the password that you entered in BIOS. This, of course, could result in the user forgetting that password and locking themselves out of their own laptop. In order to resolve that, many times you can check with the manufacturer, but you may be able to reset the BIOS in order to allow them to access that drive. But you have to be real careful with that because there's no guarantee that there will be a reset. They may have just totally messed up their hard drive and they may never be able to access it again. There's also something called Trusted Platform Management. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about BitLocker. What BitLocker does, remember, is it will encrypt the entire hard drive and it will store keys about that encryption in the Trusted Platform module, which is stored on your motherboard. Now, additional things we can do to secure our data include the following. Number one, EFS, which is the encrypting file system, and BitLocker. Now, I already talked about BitLocker and EFS in a previous nugget. I think it's when we were talking about NTFS and some of those other things relating to the file system. So certainly on sensitive systems where you have either a few sensitive files, use EFS. If it's the entire hard drive that's sensitive, use BitLocker. And you'll also use BitLocker when it comes to laptops, for sensitive laptops, because you would not want them to get lost or stolen and have people to be able to access the data. Also, when it comes to decommissioning drives, this is always a little bit of a tricky issue because, those old 20 gigabyte hard drives, they don't even store an operating system anymore, practically. So how are you going to get rid of those if they've had sensitive data on them in the past? Number one, you can check out data wiping utilities. Some of these are government certified and what they do is they will write encrypted data to the hard drive, and they will usually do it over and over and over again. So normally there's at least a triple pass that you need to use in order to wipe that data. And then after it's done wiping it, you can also format it, and then really it's pretty difficult to get anything back out of that drive. There's also drive destruction. There are certain services that are available that are also usually certified in some kind of a credential to destroy drives. And they will take your drives and guarantee that the data will be gone as well as physically destroyed so that there's not any recoverable data on even the tiniest little bit of what used to be that hard drive. So that would be a pretty fun job, wouldn't it? It's probably just a bunch of guys sitting in a garage with the big sledgehammers or something, There's also recycling drives. For this, I would combine a couple of these things. I would combine data wiping with recycling. When we say recycling here, I'm pretty much talking about donating them to nonprofits, to schools, places like that. I don't want them to, some of those kids are pretty enterprising and pretty smart. They could be able to pick out data that was left over. That's why I want to wipe the data first and then donate it to them. Then when it comes to handling sensitive data, you need to be careful about that. Normally there's going to be some kind of a compliance set of standards that you need to comply with. So if you work in the healthcare industry, you need to probably comply with HIPAA requirements. If you work in the financial sector, you might need to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley. There's other different standards that have been set up, many of them set up by the government, which specifies how to handle sensitive data like someone's medical records, and you must comply with that. In fact, a lot of the larger organizations will have full-time staff that does nothing other than make sure that the organization is in full compliance with data sensitivity. There's also classification. Different levels of data will have different levels of classification. For example, I very often go to a place that has a lot of classified data out in New Mexico to train their IT departments. Well, there's different folks in different IT departments that can be specific with what they do. There's other folks out there that cannot even tell me what their job is. I can only assume that they work in the IT department, otherwise they wouldn't be seeing me. But there's varying levels of classification that sometimes you can't even say what you're doing or what your job title is. Some of the departments that I've worked with don't even have email at all. They do have email, but it's for only internal. There's no internet access, and no emails can go outside of their department or off of their computers to some other department at all. But regardless of the level of classification, you have to be sensitive to what level of classified data it is that you're working with. Some will allow limited access to not usually the public, but to other departments, for example. And some will not, and it's very easy to violate that, so you have to be pretty familiar with that. In most organizations, by the way, if you were to go to work for one of these, especially government organizations, there's usually a whole training process to identify for you how to handle classified data, how to comply with that classified data, and what to do if you find that someone is compromising that classified data. Normally, the rule of thumb is you become a tattletale, and you tell your immediate supervisor, or you can also sometimes send an anonymous message to a specific account. And this is often done through like an intranet web page, and then somebody in the security department would investigate that. And that's what you might have to do. If, for example, you see someone with a flash drive, in a lot of organizations, they're not even allowed to have flash drives. If you see someone sneak a flash drive out of their pocket and stick it into the computer, then there's a pretty good chance that they're copying something they're not supposed to, especially since they're not even supposed to have a flash drive. So those are the kinds of things of what you want to do to check out data security and make sure that you fully comply with it. In this nugget, we're going to be talking about security. This is part 2, where we'll start off by talking about passwords. This is a very important part and basic part of making sure that a workstation is secure. There's a number of different ways that you can secure a password to make it more difficult for hackers to guess or crack using hackers' utilities. In corporations, this is very often done through what we call a group policy object, where that security policy is configured. But in small offices or home environments, you'll just have to educate the user in most instances. There's also workstations. Now, the workstation security is going to be important in terms of being sure that you properly lock workstations, or that you take other measures to secure them, such as a drive lock or intrusion detection. Then we'll talk about data security and just the general fact that if you work in a sensitive environment, there's probably going to be a whole set of standards that you have to comply with, and you have to know how to handle certain kinds of sensitive data. Security, part 2. In this nugget, we talked about security. This was part 2, where we started by talking about passwords. Remember, it's very easy for users to get lax about their passwords. Sometimes you kind of have to hound them to change their password or to use a secure password. Again, in corporate environments, we're normally going to be using a group policy object for their security policy, and that will dictate to them how often they have to change it, whether or not it uses complexity, how long it is, and so forth. But in a home environment, you might just have to kind of get on to them about that. In fact, a lot of home users don't use any password at all. It's just a blank. Also, with workstations, you have to be able to properly lock those workstations. Now, this could have some relation to passwords, because if a user enters in the incorrect password a certain number of times in many corporate environments, then it locks that workstation out, and an administrator has to unlock the user's account, and then that's the only way the user can then log back into the computer. They may also have to reset their password, or the administrator may have to do that for them. Other things you can do to secure workstations would include things such as intrusion detection and drive locks. Then we looked at data security. There may be compliance standards that you have to follow up with or make sure that you're in compliance with. And you may also have to be aware of how to handle varying levels of sensitive data. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.